Hello and welcome to ChatDPS. Every week, Robert and I get together. This week, we're very fortunate to have renowned security guru Adam Cunningham join us. Adam's got a long history of being a CISO and security advisor to boards, companies like banks and things like that. Do you want to sort of like introduce yourself a little bit, Adam?
Thanks for that, Nick. I'm Adam Cunningham. I've been in the security industry since before it was called cyber, back in the information security days, and even before that when it was just networks in the mid 90s. I've been very, very fortunate to work with a number of boards and work with some of the largest companies in Australia to build out their security vision and or products. So really happy to be on board with you today. So thanks for the invite.
Thank you, and we're delighted to have you with us and join us. And it's a very interesting thing that we're sort of kicking off with. So every week we're witnessing more hacks, more ransomware. We're beginning to understand things like social engineering attack and phishing attack. These are becoming kind of commonplace in terms of who we are, what we do, what we're witnessing. And we're asking a question this week: is it time to rethink how we're doing things, and what would you get a different result if you sort of like did things just a little bit different? So we've observed the fact that an awful lot of organizations out there are buying from a generic IT supplier, reseller partner kind of thing. They get their internet and they get their WAN and they get their, sort of like voice services from these companies, a little bit about security, right? And the idea is that, that they can supply things like desktop support and they can do the endpoint protection, they can do the firewall. And I think for some time now, we've been discussing this and suggesting that kind of we need to change how we're going with this, and maybe it would be better if organizations actually went to a more specialist company. Keep the endpoint protection and the routers and the firewalls where they are, but treat this as a whole different kind of new flavor, as it were. So when we started this conversation off, we were suggesting that a generalist would kind of confirm the words that you've got there on the piece of paper are the right words, and we can do all of that stuff. But we were kind of thinking that a more specialized security type of company would look at the words a little bit differently and maybe interpret them a little bit differently. Adam, would you like to kick off with how they might see that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the security industry, there's a nuance when it comes to standards and governance, particularly, and compliance. There's what we would call the spirit of a control. So why is the control there? What does it do? What's the reason that it helps make a business safe? And then how can that be applied to that business correctly, as opposed to how it can be applied just from a straight standpoint, like multi-factor authentication has to be there, but does it in certain situations? Is there a better way to do it for the business to drive it to the next end? And a generalist view on it would simply look at the says, and we use multi-factor as an example. They'll say, okay, it has to have multi-factor, so they'll put on the service, they'll make sure multi-factor is enabled, and then they get the green tick and good to go.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I think you actually had an anecdote about this, about sitting in the boardroom one day and the CEO comes in all pleased as punch with himself and says, "That's got MFA on everything." And you said,
yeah.
"What did you say?"
Well, kind of, yeah. So while I was doing some advisory for a board of one of my clients, the CIO and the CEO were very happy to say that they had finally finished. It was a 2.5 year long project, which was to bring multi-factor authentication to the systems of the organization. When they named out some of the critical systems, I just realized that one of them was one that I was speaking about, which happened to be a physical security control for staff in that organization that had to go out to people's homes. And basically the way it worked was it was an app on their phone, and if they felt that they were physically in danger, they would press a button and it would contact law enforcement and whatnot. Lo and behold, they had thrown multi-factor authentication on that. So how it would have worked is they would have opened the app and pressed the button and then got asked to put in a code, whilst they were fearful because there could have been a physical incident in front of them, which wasn't the best. And I was definitely not the most loved person in that boardroom for pointing that one out. It was very
So
important.
counterproductive, counterintuitive. Just hadn't thought about it. Put it on a piece
Yeah,
of paper.
it's one of those things when you look at things from a high view and you don't take the time to look at the context, then you look like you're doing the right thing and you feel like you're doing the right thing, but sometimes you can be disconnected a little bit. And it's that connection which is really, really important, is and the context of what is it that your business is doing? How does it affect the people that you give your service to or buy your service from? And then how is the best way to ensure that you're working safely?
So, Robert, you had some thoughts on this along the same vein from your perspective as well. I mean, you guys have got very different perspectives in terms of where you see the same problem, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a little bit more general than Adam's anecdote, but I often hear this criticism of lawyers that when asked for advice, they tend to give you what you as a client are looking for, as opposed to understanding what the business actually needs and then actually tailoring that advice to the business requirements. So very often you'll get some general advice, which the lawyer often thinks that's what the client wants to hear, as opposed to really understanding what the business needs and being very specific about what their risks are and what their problem is, and actually tailoring that advice to the problem. So there's that kind of general versus specificity kind of issue. And I think the other thing that I sometimes hear as well in that kind of similar theme is I've had some clients who take a very generalist approach as well, particularly to security. So particularly in that small to medium enterprise side of things, I've heard comments like, "Oh, well, I turned on Windows Defender, so therefore everything's taken care of, and now Microsoft to take care of my security." Or they'll say, "Well, I put everything in the cloud now. You know, whether it's Azure or AWS, they'll take care of the security. I don't have to worry about it." So there's this kind of very much sort of generalized thinking approach to security, which just doesn't take into consideration, as Adam said, the nuances that you actually need to consider when you're looking at security risk.
And
Yeah, and
sometimes they don't
I think
look
the
at that
point
risk.
there.
Sorry, go
Sorry,
ahead.
Adam.
Sometimes they don't look at that risk. So, for example, a certain superannuation company that went to the cloud here in Australia actually had the physical servers destroyed that all their data were on by Google. Yep. So they literally took live servers, turned them off, and shredded them, and they had all their data on them. So there's
So
risks involved in everything.
yeah, I mean, I guess I go back to your point, Adam, and to yours as well, Robert. The thing that's sort of like coming through loud and clear to me, if a little of something is good for you, a lot of it must be much better, is what boards are hearing. In my head,
Yeah.
anyway, it seems to be resonating. Sort of like there's no medicine that can't be put in by the gallon. I think that we then moved the conversation into a new kind of area, because looking back a couple of weeks ago, there was the EU Security Maturity Report. You've got to bear in mind here that the EU are just light years ahead of where we are here in Australia. They've got GDPR, they've got a range of other things around EIDAS, they've got a range of things that they're doing, and they seemingly are so far ahead of us in terms of what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I think the surprise for us particularly was that when it came down to governance in particular, there was a low maturity score in an environment where you would have thought that, we've led you to this point. There are very few points of, where you could be confused. This is where we're going. This is what we're doing. Whereas in Australia, we're still sort of floundering around a little bit with governance. And it seems to me that we're not really that on top of things. So is that an area that potentially the security organization could bring better value to than the generalist firm? Yeah.
I can go on this a little bit. I think one of the things that guides us here in Australia specifically is we're a compliance led country. And when it comes to certain compliances outside of like the ones that are very strict, like PCI DSS for utilizing of credit cards, which is a very strict standard. You've got other standards out there like ISO 27001, a number of others that are very much open to interpretation and very much you pick what's in scope and what's not in scope, and therefore you fit it to your organization. But what people forget is a lot of the times these just put the basic controls in place and it's not the goal. So whereas right now we think compliance is the goal, whereas compliance is just us putting in the foundations for our business to be able to run safely. And then there's more to it after that. And with GDPR, it's very interesting that you say that, because I do know that Australian government are trying to push through our Privacy Act to be a lot more aligned with GDPR. Which they're going to try to do over the course of the next couple of years. So it will be really interesting to see how it goes. If our government was to align with what's happening in Europe, a lot of businesses wouldn't be ready for that here currently. So there would be a need for that. I would call it like a layer above the management of things to sit in between your executive leadership team and your CIO team, your technical teams, to be able to translate exactly what's going on within their business technically, so that the business can make decisions that they actually have all the answers that they need to be able to make decisions and be informed.
Yeah, Robert, this is in line with where you've been sort of like headed for some considerable time in terms of your engagement with boards as well, isn't it?
Around the strengthening of legislation. I mean, it's certainly something I've been talking about for a number of years, and it's definitely on the horizon. It's coming. I mean, we've been talking about it's been coming for a while, but I guess with a new government in Australia that's probably going to be in for probably a lot longer than the next term. They've probably got at least a couple of terms in them. They'll probably have the confidence to introduce changes to the Privacy Act and probably other areas of legislation. So I think now is the time to really start to focus on and we talk about governance. Governance and compliance are definitely two critical areas. And to go back to your point about maturity, I think there's a couple of things that's worth touching on there. I think Australian governance is pretty poor in terms of maturity. You just have to look at some pretty high profile public examples, and I'll name a few: WiseTech Global, MinRes, PwC. And we've just saw ASIC and Macquarie Bank with derivatives trading. So very, very high public failures of governance across some pretty large organizations. And then I'd also say, when it comes to cyber attacks and data breaches, I think you can probably trace the root cause back to failures in governance as much as anything. And we can probably go into that a little bit more detail. But I think when you look at governance, risk and compliance, and we're talking a lot about governance here, that there's been just incredible failures of oversight. And whether it's at the individual level in terms of the people in charge, those at the board level, those at the executive level, and whether they have the right skill set, the right expertise to be figuring out, what are the appropriate frameworks, processes, procedures that should be in place to ensure governance. You have to question that, and then you have to kind of question some of the frameworks that they've been adopting. So, Adam's mentioned ISO 27001. I know that I've had experience that you put this framework in, and then you get somebody to audit it every couple of years or every once in 3 years in detail, and it's a check a box thing, and they do things on a sample basis, and they're there for a few days, and they'll sign it off, and maybe they'll find a few things that they'll qualify their audit with, because that's their job. They've got to find a few things, but then they'll move on. You've checked a box, but do you actually have the necessary oversight in place to ensure that your organization is properly secure? Questionable. So there's always that tension between having the right levels of oversight and just ticking a box. So I think there's a lot going on there, and I think governance is probably one of the key root causes, if not the root cause of a lot of these issues.
Yeah, so I guess the point at the end that we're coming towards is this in place because boards themselves are more generalist by nature? They've got a bunch of schoolmates and all the rest of it, jobs for the boys. I know that's not how it works, but it kind of looks like that from the outside sometimes. Oh yeah, we've got to get I've got a mate that knows that, or we'll put somebody through a rigorous sort of like interview process and bring them through. But it seems to me a lot of boards are more sort of like they're all the same. They're not. There's no diversity in the boards. There's no diversity. I mean, diversity of sort of like men and women is one thing, but diversity of skill set, sort of like, oh, I've been running boards for 20 years. You've got 1 year experience doing the same thing 20 times. Yeah. I mean, rather than actually, 20 years experience in a particular field. Yeah. Board experience. So what? I mean, is that fair, or is that unreasonable?
So yes and no. There is generally a call towards CEOs, solicitors, and usually because a board is responsible for the growth and direction of a business. So a lot of the time they want to make sure that they have people in place that are able to go that way. A trend that's happening at the moment that I have seen is a lot of boards now take on advisory boards with specialist components. I think the dream is to be in an area where you have someone like Robert on the board who understands cybersecurity legal, right? So, or someone like myself or yourself, Nick, in the industry who's able to help with them. But in the interim, while things are changing, this idea of sub boards or advisory boards are very, very good because it gives that third party perspective to board members so that they can make informed decisions. But it's only happening at the bigger size companies and also within government. So within government, you've got like director generals that now are building out like audit and risk committees as an advisory board, and they've got different views in them, from cybersecurity to law to fraud.
But do you have any sort of like feelings on this, or is this it might bark up the wrong tree?
No, no. I think there's definitely something in there, and I mean, I think well, there's a couple of things. I think the way the Corporations Act is drafted at the moment, it's probably a little bit too easy for a board to rely on expert advice from, whether that's coming within the organisation or an external advisor, and go, well, I've managed to outsource the risk. I've taken advice from this external party, and therefore I'm not personally liable under the Corporations Act if things go wrong. But I think where we need to look at in terms of accountability is what is, I mean, and some of this advice may be very good in terms of how you deal with the risks within the business. There needs to be more accountability in terms of implementing that advice. So I think with some of these cases that we're seeing, and again, they may be very specific in nature. So I talk about RI advice, for example, which came out a couple of years ago, and then we've seen one recently with Fig Securities, or again ASIC going after an organisation with poor practices. It might be, who knows? I'm just going to speculate, but it might be that they got some external advice about what security measures need to be put in place, but did they actually implement them? And what are the consequences? Where's the accountability, particularly for the board and the executive, to actually take that advice, put that into practice, and then if they don't do that, actually be held accountable for failure to actually put that advice into practice. So I think where I'm going with that is that it's too easy to outsource. You need to have a certain degree of knowledge around what you're being told, around where the risks are, and actually implement that. So it's not just about outsourcing, but it's actually taking accountability, understanding the business risks, informing yourself of that, making sure you really understand it, and then you don't do that, then suffer the consequences.
If I can pick up on that one, Nick, one of the things that I see all the time with boards is the conversation. If I use a more established area, fraud, for example, right, money laundering, fraud, that type of area, if something happens within a business that looks or even smells that it looks like it's going in that direction, the first thing every board member asks any of the advisors is, will this send me to jail? Right. And at the moment, as per Robert's statement just before, that there's not a lot in the cybersecurity space outside of the Privacy Act that has that kind of an outcome. And it's mainly because this is still relatively a new area for boards to be looking at, for it to elevate to this stage. So I think, or at least I'm hopeful, that as it grows in maturity and then legislative changes come in place, so that it's on the same level as that, because the risk level is the same.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to that old adage, you just cannot outsource risk, right? I mean, what we've witnessed, is the Privacy Act appears to be the only piece of legislation with real teeth at this moment in time. It's debatable. You're being told SOCI's taking you down a particular road and telling you and being more prescriptive about things. But now we've got Carly Kind coming out, who's the commissioner for the OAIC, and saying that she's absolutely looking for test cases around, and she's got to start off with where doing dumb things faster, I guess, would be the starting point. Who's done some really dumb things. We've kind of highlighted a few of those things in the recent past. So it's taking us in a particular direction, right? And hopefully we're all right, and somebody is actually paying attention, and GDPR type laws are going to be coming in, and maybe that's what the emphasis behind what Carly Kind's actions have been just recently.
Yeah, again, we need to see action from the regulators. We need to see the consequences, and unfortunately, the OAIC seems to have been really struggling with between Optus, Medibank, and Latitude, just three big recent cyber attacks, really struggling to follow through in terms of the consequences. Optus and Medibank were before the change to the penalties in the Privacy Act, where they lifted them to at least $50 million for a serious breach. Latitude is actually called in that potential $50 million minimum penalty, but we're still waiting to see. This is, we're more than 2 years gone from Optus and Medibank, and we're still waiting to see those consequences. So the big sticks are there, but they have to be used. And you do sort of wonder when you talk about these things, what reaction organizations are having to this really big stick. And I think what I tend to see is that when a particular sector gets hit by a cyber attack, a data breach, then that particular sector tends to react. So if it's the legal sector, if it's the health sector, what you tend to see is the players within that sector go, oh, that was pretty close, not us, thank goodness, but my fellow organization in this sector got hit. Oh, that's really bad. Maybe we should be doing something about cybersecurity. So it seems to be, the reaction seems to be very sector specific, and I think all boards need to take account of the fact that penalties are significant under the Privacy Act, but also that there are consequences under SOC, which include criminal consequences for directors if they fail to act. Boards have got to sign off on the risk management plan every year, so that there's some pretty big consequences. Even under the Corporations Act, there are significant penalties and disqualifications there for directors and officers. So, but what's going to be interesting, particularly with this fixed securities case that I mentioned that ASIC's brought early this year, what are the consequences is going to be? Are they actually going to enforce something against the directors and officers of this particular organization? Now, ASIC are taking that particular action under the AFSL, the Financial Services License provisions of the Corporations Act, so particularly targeting those particular sections of the Corporations Act, which talked about having adequate resources, adequate oversight of that particular financial services business. It's more specific, and there's probably more ability for ASIC to bring a successful case under those sections of the Corporations Act rather than the general section. So what I'm talking about is, if you look at Section 912 as it applies to financial services, it's different to Section 180, which is a lot broader, and you don't tend to see cases being brought by ASIC under 180 because it's a bit broader, and because as long as a director does the reasonable thing, generally speaking, they're okay. 912, if you're a financial services organization, should make you a little bit more concerned in the light of our advice, in the light of FIG securities. So it's not just the Privacy Act. There are other bits of legislation out there which have significant consequences for directors and officers. But again, it comes back to, we really need to see those consequences being followed through by the regulators. We need to see significant fines, organizations being made example of, and we need to see directors and officers being held accountable. That's hopefully, I mean, it's obviously not a nice thing, but we need to see those examples being set over the next couple of years. And like I say, with the new government in place, hopefully the regulators will have the confidence. Yeah, with a mandate, hopefully we'll see the regulators come down pretty hard on some of these organisations that I've mentioned.
Yeah, I think just to finish off then, so I think that there's a couple of things that we've kind of identified through this process, and that is you can't outsource risk. We've also, I think reading between the lines, what we can also agree upon is the fact that the legal frameworks are not able to move as quickly as the hackers and the threat actors. So with that in mind, I think that we're sort of suggesting that maybe there is a space here for the specialist security organization, somebody that can advise a board, somebody that can give them legal advice, somebody that can give them technical advice, somebody that can give them a perspective on products and services that might actually help them and avoid any of the conflicts that boards are currently struggling with am I going to go to jail, to quote you, Adam. So is that a fair roundup?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is also one thing that I would like to ask both of you from it. There is, I suppose, in my mind, a perceived loophole when it comes to accountability for boards. There are, in certain organizations, an interesting culture of no bad news up, and things get filtered out quite low down the stack, like middle management level. So they don't even get up to the CIO, to get to the CEO, to get to the board. So a lot of the time there's, for lack of a better way of putting it, in the original context of the word, ignorance at the board level of what the risk actually looks like. And it's quite interesting to me, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, Robert, around around the rules and being responsible as a director or as a company director. When you're not given the information to act upon, then where does the responsibility fall? Because middle management obviously doesn't have any real accountability from a business perspective.
Well, I think this comes back to oversight. So what processes and procedures did that organization have in place? Should they have been informed of these sorts of events that are going down at this middle management level? They need to take a proactive approach. You can't just sit back and claim plausible deniability, and when things blow up say, well, we didn't know about this was happening at the middle management level. That's not going to fly. I mean, I suppose in one sense, because the regulators tend to be quite softly, it probably does fly at the moment. I mean, this is where the trend is going, and the trend is going to really try and make directors and officers liable for the actions of everyone within the organisations. I think the message has to be that you can't just rely on plausible deniability. You should be proactive with your oversight, because as we know, with a lot of these, particularly when we look at security, it's happening at that lower level. It's the employee who mistakenly downloaded some malware. It's somebody within the supply chain who's been, and you just cannot sit back and go, well, we didn't know about that. You've got to be doing your due diligence on your supplies. You've got to be proactive in terms of oversight across the organisation, because as it keeps saying, we're going after directors and officers. Cybersecurity is the number one risk that you should all be keeping up at night, and you should be doing something about this. And if they're successful with fixed securities, they're going to find other organisations to go after. So they're trying to change the narrative. They're putting the signals out there. They're trying to put more teeth into us. And so my view is you just can't sit back. You've really got to sort of listen to what the regulators are saying. You've got to see what's coming over the horizon, and you need to actually take action, because you don't want to be the next one. You don't want to be the next cab off the rank.
Yeah, I guess the only thing, I mean, I completely agree with you, Robert. I think there's genuinely that oversight piece is there. The one thing that I think I'd like to add is that, it's a cultural problem when you're actually in there, right? I mean, we've all been in companies, we've seen them, they've got their values written upon the wall, but they never talk about them. It's just something they never do. And you're right, Adam, if it's like an autocracy like that, it's like, we don't want to hear it about, sort of like, all right, you can talk about it, but I'm not going to listen kind of thing. So you could say that, people would have talked about it quite openly, but they're not going to be thanked for bringing a problem to the table, because don't bring me problems, just bring me solutions is an often heard, sort of mantra from certain types of board member, so those values, understanding what your values are, understanding how you're structured, understanding that you've got feedback, understanding that there's training, understanding that it's actually part and parcel of your DNA as an organization, that those are things that you actually put into place and that you actually live those values, rather than actually just stick them up on the wall and never talk about them, and they get dusty and somebody comes in and mops them down every now and again.
Yeah, I'd love to see the SOCI Act add that proactiveness into it as a need for the board to be looking for things as opposed to receiving things. That would be a fantastic change across the board. Just that little bit of proactivity will do a lot for corporate culture just by itself.
Yeah. And look, and that is one of the intentions of SOCI, is for it to introduce proactive requirements within the legislation. So a board just can't sit back. It actually has to sign off and be responsible for, like I say, risk management plans. It needs to proactively report on which suppliers it's using to operate the organisation. So there is that intention of proactiveness that's coming through SOCI. Maybe not so much in some of the other bits of legislation, which tends to be very principles based. And it's very much up to the organisation to figure out what to do, which isn't very helpful. But I think one thing I would sort of go back to is, I mentioned this ASIC versus FIG securities, and they publish within that. If you look at the summary of the matter against FIG securities, a whole series of things that FIG securities didn't do, from incident response to risk management. Between that and some of the guidance that APRA puts out, there's starting to get a real repository of guidance and guidelines around what organisations should be doing if they're not doing it already. Look through some of the missteps steps of some of these organizations that I've mentioned. So, I'd really encourage anyone who's watching this going, well, what am I supposed to do? Is have a look at what some of the areas that ASIC are pointing to in terms of guidelines about what some of the basic things you should be doing. So I think that's probably a good resource to mention.
Absolutely.
Okay. Any passing words of wisdom before we end up?
I think from my perspective, make sure that you are getting independent advice across your business as a whole instead of looking at it at segments. Have someone look at it holistically and look at what you're doing and making sure that you're safely using technology to make your outcome better.
Thank you, Adam. Robert, any last words from yourself, mate?
I think, as I mentioned, there's things coming over the horizon that's aimed strictly at directors and officers of organizations. And you really need to be asking questions about, do I have sufficient oversight of the business that I'm running? Am I really taking proactive ownership of this particular business, or am I sitting back waiting for a cyber attack or a data breach to happen? Because that's the wrong way of going about things. If you're sitting back and you're outsourcing risk and you're outsourcing reporting, you really need to turn that around and really become much more proactive, much more engaged in the risks that the business faces, and be asking yourself questions around, I don't want to be another Optus, Medibank, Latitude, Marks and Spencers, whatever example you might have. I don't want to be the next one. What have I got to do as a business to avoid that? What processes, procedures, what technologies do I need to put in place to make sure that I'm accountable and proactive, and I avoid being on the front page of whichever newspaper you want to talk about, and also suffering consequences from ever active and aggressive regulators. So you need to be thinking about these questions should be keeping you up at night rightly, and you need to be doing something about it.
Yeah, because they are coming to get you, right?
Yeah. And never think you're
okay.
too small as a company.
And never think it's too small.
Because
But $3 million as a turnover now. I mean, it's small enough to be. $3 million is a very, very low threshold for entry, right? But anyway, as a turnover number. Okay, guys. Well, look, I will end it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Adam. I think we're going to be seeing you a little bit more over the next couple of weeks, or next few weeks anyway. And Robert, thank you so much again. That was ChatDPS for this week. Thank you for joining us. Bye now.
Thank you for having me. Bye now.